So it is my pleasure to welcome you to our fourth webinar, the talks organized in the framework of our Year C project, FIBO, Federalism and Border Management in Greek Antiquity, funded by the European Research Council and hosted by the Department of Humanities of Trento. FIBO aims at exploring the diverse strategies applied and diverse cultures applied by Greek federal states in order to help secure stability, both on their internal borders and on their external borders. We are especially interested in the role played by techniques of balance of power, as well as networks of formal or informal political actors who crossed borders on a regular basis and invigorated these borders and these border spaces together with the things they carried. Since intrafederal and interfederal external borders must necessarily be approached from different perspectives and with different questions, FIBO organizes, that is me with Claudio Biagetti and Sebastian Scharf, we organize two distinct series of webinars, one devoted to the external borders, Crossing Federal Borders, Ancient and Modern, this is the title that this series bears, and the other one on internal borders, the management of internal borders by federal states. Both series have been initiated by the inaugural lecture delivered by Hans Beck on March the 7th, which focused on a case study involving both intrafederal and extrafederal borders, as today, I guess. In fact, we have assigned today's webinar to the series dedicated to internal borders, but clearly it could be in both, because today's subject is proxeny, and in particular, small case proxeny. In a forthcoming paper entitled The Other Side of the Stone, Local Proxenia in the Hellenistic Euboean Gulf, to be published in a book edited by Sheila Ager and Hans Beck on Hellenistic localism, A.McAuley, our guest, asks a very interesting question. So, spoiler, how does proxenia play out on a very local level, that is between really neighboring communities? How does this small scale proxeny work if these neighboring communities belong each to a different koinon? Did the geographical proximity prevail over political separation? And this makes me also wonder to what extent border zones between koina can really separate. We look forward to hearing from our guest, Professor A.McAuley, who needs no introduction, but I'll just say a few words for our younger students. Alex is lecturer at the Faculty of Arts, Humanities, New Zealand, University of Auckland, and fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He got his PhD at McGill, and then was lecturer at University of British Columbia, Vancouver, and at Cardiff University. His primary research interest is the society and culture of the Hellenistic world in the Greek mainland, with an eye to determining whether the local life of the mainland Greeks was marked more by continuity and rupture. Seeking to better understand the ancient dynamics of what we now call globalism, by determining whether small corners of the Greek mainland really did adopt and adapt new cultural elements from the broader Hellenistic arena, or whether life simply went on as before. In addition to this, he also works on the dynastic ideology and practices of the Seleucid and Ptolemaic dynasties, with particular interest in the place and role of their royal women. A.McAuley published several books, among them Sister Queens in the High Hellenistic Period, Cleopatra Thea and Cleopatra III in 2021, and with Hans Beck and Kostas Bouraselis, Ethnos and Koinon, Studies in Ancient Greek Ethnicity and Federalism, and several articles and book chapters. I limit myself to quoting the one on the Seleucid royal family as a reigning triad, and the one on the tradition and ideology of naming Seleucid Queens, published on Historia. I'm grateful to Alex for accepting our invitation and tackling the remarkable challenge of connecting at Febinar's time, which is not at all convenient for you. And I am delighted to give you the floor now to talk about under and through the border, proxeny across federal borders in the Hellenistic Peloponnese. Alex, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Elena. Kia ora. Very good morning, everybody, from here in the Southern Hemisphere on a bit of a chilly evening in Auckland. And thank you so much for that introduction and for the invitation, Elena. It's a great pleasure to be here. And it's wonderful to be able to take part in this, even from the North Island of New Zealand here. It's a wonderful series, and I hope that my topic this evening sits within both streams of the internal management of borders and the external relationships of these. But before I begin, I just wanted to say another note of congratulations more broadly to Elena, Sebastian, and Claudio for this wonderful project as a whole in the webinar series. I think this is deeply cutting-edge work that is asking some very profound questions that really deserve to be tackled head on. So again, congratulations once again to everybody who's involved. Now, before we get going this evening, I do need to preface all of this by apologizing in advance if my bibliography for this seminar tonight is a little bit thinner, a little bit lighter than it should be, because as some of you know, I'm in the process of relocating from Cardiff to Auckland. And all of my books, along with all of my office materials and my dishwasher and things like this, are currently on a shipping container that spent the last 3 months making its way from Cardiff to Auckland, first on the noble vessel MSC Venice, and then on the noble vessel Renjon 16, which arrived in Auckland last Thursday. Now, as soon as the friendly people at Biosecurity New Zealand clear it, all will be well. But we've been working with PDFs for this, and my thanks to Hans Beck and other colleagues for sending along a few materials to get ready for this seminar tonight. At any rate, again, it's a pleasure to be here, and my title for this evening, as Elena said, is Under and or Through the Border, Proxenia Across Federal Borders in the Hellenistic Peloponnese. And again, I think this is a topic that sits well in our broader consideration of internal and external borders of koina in the Hellenistic world. So my focus this evening or morning is the institution of proxenia, which has really enjoyed something of a renaissance in the study of the Hellenistic world in recent years, thanks in no small part to Will Mack's 2015 monograph and his ongoing database, of which you see a map on the screen. Now, luckily, we can say that the days are long gone in the past when proxenia was dismissed as a meaningless, empty gesture, and indeed a gesture whose prevalence was taken as being yet another indication of the decline of Greek civic culture in the world of Alexander. And instead, in recent years, especially in the last 10 or 15 or so, the focus on this ubiquitous institution in the Hellenistic world has really shifted, I think. And recently, we've been trying to understand how proxenia in the Hellenistic world can begin to be used to understand the relationships between and among different civic communities and individuals. And all of this, of course, plays out in this urban world of the Hellenistic period that John Ma so helpfully characterized as being one of peer polity interaction. Now, this idea of proxenia as being fundamentally a network institution and a networking approach to it is really one that lies at the core of Will Mack's book. And Will Mack has really followed in this broader trend of bringing network theory to the ancient, especially the Greek world, that has really yielded some fascinating insights. Now, the sheer scale, reach, and frequency of proxenia, as you can see it on this map from the Oxford Proxenies project, is quite striking. But it also raises some very, very intriguing questions that I think are quite relevant to the broader investigations of the FIBO project. Now, the first is, how this map of proxenies that you see here, which again is just the overall output of the database that Will Mack puts together, how does this map of proxenies relate to the broader political geography of Greek federations, particularly in the 3rd century that you see here? Does Proxenia transcend federal borders? Does it go above them? And if so, does Proxenia cross federal borders because of or despite Greek koina? So does Proxenia work through, above, or below federal borders? Now, the second consideration that I want to touch on this evening emerges from the fact that large-scale perspectives like this map, when we zoom out very, very far and look at the Greek mainland and the Greek world as a whole, these tend to conceal how frequently Proxenia is used in the local or regional scale, in the realm of what Will Mack calls the, quote, local region of primary interaction of a given community. And then following on from this, what happens when this local region of primary interaction lies across the borders of several different federal states? So take, for instance, this snapshot of the proxenic activity of the city of Lettere in Arcadia in the 3rd century BC, most likely before 221-220 BC. Now, this proxenic network crosses the regions and the koina of Arcadia, Achaia, Aetolia, Locris, and others. And all of this, of course, takes place during a particularly turbulent political time. Now, at the same time, out of a total of 98 proxenoi who were honored by the city, 59 of them, over 60%, come from other communities in the Peloponnese. So there is a distinctly Peloponnesian focus to this. And as we shall see, Lettere is certainly not alone in this respect, and certainly not alone in having this pattern of proxenic interactions. And so tonight, I want to use the Hellenistic Peloponnese as an environment for considering how Proxenia relates to the borders between and among federal states, and how we can use Proxenia in order to better understand the place of a given polis within a bigger federal constellation. Now, as Elena mentioned, I've tried to do this before in the Euboean Gulf, and tonight we will instead use the Hellenistic Peloponnese as an environment for considering these questions. So in order to do this, I want to focus on 2 different proxenic case studies that operate on different scales. The first is the local world of the polis of Lusoi in the north of Arcadia near the region's border with Achaia. And the second is looking at the regional world of the Argolid. In the process, I want to consider what, if any, role federal borders play in these proxenic networks, and how this 4th and 3rd century snapshot of proxenic activity relates to the broader history of these regions of the Peloponnese. And throughout, I think that especially in the 3rd and 2nd century, we can use Proxenia as something of a litmus test, as an indicator for how these borders function in the region and beyond. But first, though, we need to reconsider some of our preconceived notions regarding Proxenia itself and its relationship to Greek federalism before we dive into the Hellenistic Peloponnese. So here is our itinerary for this evening. So how do we understand the relationship between Proxenia and federalism? Well, to really get to this, I think we need to begin by revisiting some of our basic assumptions regarding the institution of Proxenia itself. Now, a dominant assumption regarding Proxenia is often that it was a purely honorific or symbolic status that served to create a diplomatic or political link between 2 communities, often 2 communities that were separated by a great distance. So the term proxenos for most of the 19th and 20th century, for instance, was translated as ambassador or envoy in most English low classical texts. And this assumption reappears in Will Mack's monograph on the topic, in which a proxenos is described as fundamentally being an intermediary figure. And indeed, someone who plays an intermediary role. As you see here, this quotations from Mac, someone who could be expected to help visitors from the granting city. And the services of proxenoi, quote, collectively amounted to an intermediary role, allowing individuals from one city access to the institutions and networks of their proxenos polis. Now, the corollary to this assumption is that the proxenos themselves is almost always assumed to have remained almost exclusively in their own community. And again, as Mac writes, quote, they lived and indeed died where they were expected to in political contexts external to the granting polis. Now, there are two things to note here before we move on. The first is that in the local realm in which proxenia can operate, which we'll discuss this evening, say between communities that are separated by a journey of only 1 or 2 days, the status, I think, must imply that the proxenos was either partially resident or frequently traveled between the two communities. And indeed, as A.McAuley has noted, we need to bear in mind both the symbolic and the practical value of proxenia, both to a granting community and to its recipient. And this diplomatic role is quite clear, but we also need to bear in mind that for those traveling regularly to the community that honored them as proxenos, the privileges that are associated with it that you see on the slide here would have been immensely beneficial. And especially in this local realm, they probably would have been frequently used. Now, in the Peloponnesian context, we find a pretty standard package of privileges given to proxenoi that include asilia and atelia, so freedom from taxation, and katasis, the right to acquire land and houses, and epinomia, the right to graze livestock on land. And again, all of these in the local context would have been very advantageous to the recipient, not to mention these would have been valuable gifts for a civic community to give away. Now, outside of Athenian contexts, we also need to bear in mind that proxenos is a more vague term that simply means guest friend of a city. When we dive into the literary attestations a little bit, this notion that proxenoi do not live in the community that honored them is a distinctly Athenian one. And indeed, the definition of a proxenos as, quote, persons representing the interests of a foreign state in their own community, end quote, is derived exclusively from literary, not epigraphic attestations from Athens alone, largely in the 5th and the 4th century. There are a variety of examples of this, but it's only in the Athenian context that a proxenos is like an ambassador in a formal sense, living away from the community in which he is proxenos. In the epigraphic circumstances and in non-Athenian literary attestations, a proxenos is a more generic guest friend or even patron and witness. So a proxenos as such is not automatically an external ambassador in a diplomatic sense. And the abstract noun proxenia is just shorthand for the privileges associated with it. And indeed, Sebastian sent me a wonderful reference, I think, from the 5th century, in which Zeus and Apollo and other deities are described as proxenoi of a given city. So it is a much more loose and imprecise term than we may have thought. Now, we do have indications that proxenoi could and indeed live in the city which had granted them residence. Here we have the very interesting example of Sostratos of Athens being made a proxenos of Thespiae in Boeotia in recognition of his service to the city by training its young men and boys in the arts of warfare. Now, clearly, he was indeed living in the city, and even though he was not from the Boeotian League itself still, he could, of course, and was able to be resident and buy property in Thespiae, thanks to his status. And it's an interesting thing to note in this case, because Sostratos is hired by the city in order to comply with a law of the koinon that mandates and normalizes the training of young men and boys in preparation for the ephebeia. And then in response for his excellent service in this, we have him being given proxenia by the city itself. So it's a wonderful overlap between federal structures, local civic structures, and this broader political landscape. And again, of course, all of this means that he will be living in the community. And indeed, this will continue into the future, given that the status in this case is hereditary and will be transmitted to his descendants. Now, this is a crucial point that's raised by Mac in his discussion of the expectations around proxenia. The institution itself is both rear and forward-looking. On the one hand, it acknowledges past service to a given community, but on the other, it also assumes that this relationship is going to continue into the future. So through Proxenia, then, we get an instantaneous snapshot of a community's relationships with external individuals. And in the case of Stratos here, interestingly, again, he's honored for having served the community so well in its efforts to fit into the broader federal landscape. And again, the fact that he was neither Boeotian nor Megarian doesn't seem to have been a problem at all. But the Stratos decree does bring us to this interesting question of how Proxenia interacts with the structures, laws, and norms of Greek koina. Now, taking a closer look, though, this begins to show that Proxenia can relate to federalism in very diverse and interesting ways. And we certainly don't need to think that Proxenia is somehow at odds with or sits awkwardly or against federalism as a concept. Now, there are a few observations to make about the relationship between Proxenia and federalism before we turn to this unique environment of the Peloponnese tonight. There are a few different levels on which this relationship between Proxenia and the koinon operates. And as you likely know, there are attestations of Proxenia being granted at the federal level by the koinon to a specific individual, notably by the Boeotian and Aetolian leagues in the 3rd centuries. The Boeotian League, following Rosh and Fosse, granted Proxenia valid throughout the entire territory of the koinon, a total of 42 times in the surviving record, out of which 34 are legible enough to reconstruct. The general pattern here seems to be that federal Proxenia is primarily a diplomatic tool, and a tool that's used to foster relationships with Boeotia's external neighbors. Individuals in the north of Greece and Asia Minor, as you see on the map here, are honored, and later decrees from between 240 and 210 or so focus on Athenians and Halkidians, along with other power players in the north of the mainland and beyond. Now, a courtier of Antiochus III is also honored, so Proxenia could provide a means of interface between the koinon and a given royal court. Now, I think given the distances involved in this instance and the fact that these are mostly just one-off grants of federal proxeny, it does seem to me that Fosse is quite right in, quote, seeing in this distribution the reality of the political military situation of the Hellenistic period, end quote, at the time, notably with Macedonia and North Greece, along with Pontus and the Aegean, being recipients of this proxenic activity. I think, again, given the distances involved here, there does not seem to be a commercial or an economic dynamic here. And interestingly, the Achaean League seems to have, or rather the Arcadian League, seems to have woven a similar web in the 4th century in support of the sanctuary of Zeus Lycaios through federal proxeny as well. Now, the Aetolian League seems to have also used federal level proxenia for a similarly diplomatic and strategic function. In a 1991 article, John Fosse analyzed a fairly long list of honorands preserved on an inscription from the Aetolian federal sanctuary of Thermon, which lists a total of 158 individuals who were given proxenia in the 3rd century. The combinations of honors in this corpus is very interesting, and Fosse identifies 4 main groups. First, those who were just given federal proxenia for a total of 101 individuals. Second, those who were given proxenia along with isopoliteia or politeia for a total of 30. Third, those who were only given politeia for a total of 13. And fourth, those whose precise honors don't survive in a clear format for a total of 114 people. But given that this is a single long list, though, I think it's safe to say that they were all made proxenoi in one form or another. Now, the chronological distribution of these lists gives Fosse a sense of its political context, and there seem to be 2 main clusters of federal proxenic activity that date to the 270s and 260s, and then a little bit later to between the 220s and the 190s BC. The first cluster of these proxenic relationships seems to relate to the aftermath of the Aetolian League's victory against the Gauls, and therefore when it grew substantially into a dominant power in central Greece. The second period of activity is when Aetolia emerges again to prominence as an ally of Rome in the First and Second Macedonian Wars. And you can see this geographical distribution here on the map. And again, it's pretty striking that this encompasses essentially the entire Greek mainland and the Aegean. Now, a somewhat tighter cluster can be found in the later group around the First and Second Macedonian Wars. And this, of course, reflects the strategic divisions in the mainland at the time. But the salient point for us tonight, though, is that the Aetolian koinon, like the Boeotians, was quite happy to grant federal proxenia to individuals from external cities, leagues, regions, and kingdoms, thereby inviting them across the federal border on behalf of all of its member city-states. But how then does federal proxenia relate to civic proxenia? Now, the recent study of Alexander Wilding on the Amphirion in Oropos reminds us that we don't need to fall into the old trap of assuming that federal proxenia somehow overshadows or undermines or weakens local communities and their ability to grant the status to others. Indeed, we see in the case of Oropos and the Amphirion a very fascinating example of federal and civic structures working hand in hand in giving proxenia across federal and regional borders. Now, according to Wilding, there are a total of 32 federal grants of proxenia preserved at the Amphirion in Oropos that date to 250 to 200 BC, which of course was not exactly a very calm or peaceful time for relationships among federations in central Greece. Indeed, it's a period that A.McAuley describes quite rightly as one of nearly constantly shifting alliances and warfare. Now, interestingly, Wilding notes that many of these federal decrees of proxenia, which again give rights of proxenia across the entire territory of the koinon, many of these federal decrees, indeed almost the majority, were either proposed or ratified by citizens of Oropos itself. So federal proxenia across a large geographic space becomes the means by which local elites can further involve themselves, and by extension, the city of Oropos and its sanctuary, in the political life of a koinon of which they had only been part since 287. So in this case, and it's a really brilliant discussion that she has here, federal proxenia can serve to highlight the importance of Oropos within the koinon itself, rather than weakening its own civic culture. And this in turn allows local elites the space to promote their own local standing by showcasing their federal interaction. Now, in the process, of course, this proxenic web certainly crossed the federal boundaries between Boeotia, Achaea, Aetolia, and beyond. And again, this doesn't seem to have been a problem at all with the mechanism. Now, there are a few points to draw from this fairly extensive review of how proxenia works in the local realm and how it interacts with federal structures. The first is that in the local realm, proxenia could and indeed was a practical status that involved tangible and real political rights that would have been extremely valuable to the person who was being honored. The second is that proxenia could facilitate and enable exchange, travel, and partial residency between the communities that are involved. Third, this local interaction could and indeed did function across federal boundaries. All the while, it seems that koina themselves simultaneously were quite happy to make use of federal level proxenia for their own political and strategic goals. And none of this, we need to remember, seems to have compromised the integrity or the autonomy of the individual polis member state in this mechanism. And so with all of this in mind, now we can turn to the local world of Lusoi. Now, in her excellent discussion of proxenia, A.McAuley, in her monograph on the Peloponnese, observes that because of the painfully formulaic and routine nature of proxenic decrees, the fact that all of these decrees almost read in the exact same way, with the same intro, the same package of rights, then the same conclusion, we often have little to no insight into what the honorand actually did in order to deserve the status, or what the practical or symbolic value of the status would have been. We almost never have a sense of the immediate context behind the grant of proxenia. But I think in the case of Lusoi, and the argolid to which we'll turn next, maybe we can propose and hopefully arrive at a clearer picture of what this status and what this interaction actually involved. Now, the city of Lusoi is a landlocked polis in the far north of Arcadia, right on the region's border with Achaia and not too far from its frontier with Corinth. Near the city was the sanctuary of Artemis Hemera, which you see on the screen here, which since at least the 5th century had hosted the festival of Artemis Hemerasia. And as we see in many other parts of the Greek mainland at the end of the 4th century, the time of the end of the 4th century and the beginning of the 3rd was a time in which the expansion of the sanctuary and the revitalization of its festival took place. And this is the exact same pattern that we see throughout Boeotia and the Argolid. It's this kind of local renaissance in civic sanctuaries and their respective festivals at the turn of the 4th and 3rd century. Now, excavations in the region, most recently by the Austrian Academy, show that a substantial building program in the sanctuary of Artemis Hemerasia took place at the close of the 4th century, which involved the construction of a monumental propylaeon, a much larger temple, a fountain house, and a bouleuterion, along with expansion of the houses in the city itself. Lusoi sent an embassy of Theoroi to bring the news of this rejuvenated festival of the Hemerasia to communities outside the region. Perelman's reconstruction says that these ambassadors were sent to Messenia and Achaia in the Peloponnese, and further north to Aetolian Locris, Aetolia, and then onwards to Acarnania and Epirus. As was customary, the city recognized Theodokoi who received these ambassadors and honored them with the status of proxenos. And you can see here this distribution on this map. So again, it seems as if the embassies went to Messenia, Achaia in the Peloponnese, and then farther north to Locris, Aetolia, and then Acarnania and Epirus. Now, although the inscription recording these grants of proxenia isn't particularly detailed when it comes to the precise rights given, I think we can probably reconstruct the overall package of proxenic rights that we have here by comparison. Now, when we compare this to other grants of proxenia from Lusoi, I think it is safe to say that all of these proxenoi were given the fairly standard rights of asphileia, usulia, eponomia, atelia, and enkatasis. Now, eponomia and enkatasis in particular would have been valuable commodities in this mountainous grazing region. And again, these grants crossed federal borders, although the exact outline of these federations at the time is a little bit difficult to determine with any kind of precision. Now, the communities from which these proxenoi of Lusoi came were not, strictly speaking, terribly far away. And so again, I think that we must assume that the economic rights granted through this status would have been used in practice rather than just being an empty honorific or a purely symbolic gesture. And interestingly, the archaeological data for trade and exchange at Lusoi maps fairly neatly onto this proxenic network. Graham Shipley's analysis of pottery in the region reveals the links of Lusoi to Achaia, areas north of the Gulf of Corinth, especially Phocis and Locris, and Olympia, and also indicates a high volume of local production of household, ritual, and architectural ceramics. Veronica Mitsopoulos-Leon's analysis of votive offerings at the sanctuary itself of Artemis Hemera also indicates that these practical links were present, which map almost perfectly onto the proxenic network. Cast bronze scarabs were found at the site, similar only to those produced by Laconian craftsmen attested at Olympia. 450 terracotta statuettes of Corinthian production, and some perhaps from Pericora on the other side of the Gulf, were also found, along with fragments of clay statuettes that are very similar to those of Laconian and Messenian girls that seem to appear in Laconia and Messenia in competitions in honor of Artemis or Thea. Now, Mitsopoulos-Leon's analysis of the houses at Lusoi also reinforces this picture that's painted by the city's proxenic and cultic interactions, all the while bringing to light the material prosperity in the period on the ground. Stamps were found in these houses that were used in the production of large clay objects that were then used at the sanctuary, and also probably used to ordain, or rather as ornaments for the temenos itself. And there were also a variety of molds that were found that were used for the cakes used in offerings to the goddess. Now, the ceramic and the pottery record in these houses too is also pretty fascinating. And it indicates that pottery from Patras was imported, which was a proxenic destination, and also Elis, to which Lusoi also exported pottery. Pottery that was produced in Lusoi was also found in Argos and Corinth, and there is some material exchange with Macedon as well. So what do we learn from this example of Lusoi? Well, I think that in light of the material record that we have, it doesn't seem to be too far-fetched to think that this local economic activity would have been reflected in and perhaps facilitated by its proxenic network. But at the same time, we don't need to reduce proxenia here to purely commercial or economic motivations. Instead, we see that theoria and proxenia go hand in hand here, as cultic interactions are interwoven with economic exchange. All of this, it seems, functions smoothly and indeed recurrently across federal borders. And here we need to bear in mind Perlman's comments about the relationship between proxenia and theodokia, in which an individual is a theodokos of the deity and a proxenos of the city. And this seems to be the case here in Lusoi as well. So much for the individual city of Lusoi at this one point in time. What then can we say about proxenia on the regional level over a slightly longer chronological time frame? How did these ties over the longer term interact with the federal geography of the Peloponnese? So to consider this, we're going to turn to the case study of the Argolid before putting forward some concluding thoughts. Now, following Oxford's Proxeny Networks project, there are a total of 148 recorded grants of proxenia by communities in the Argolid to individuals in a time period that spans from the 4th to the 2nd centuries BC. Now, on the flip side, a total of 57 individuals from the Argolid's communities are attested as having received proxenia from other communities in the same time period. So here we're dealing with a corpus of roughly 205 cases of proxenia. Now, obviously, given the constraints of time and scope, I don't want to provide an exhaustive overview of this 205 strong corpus, but I think when we consider it as a whole, there are some pretty noteworthy patterns that emerge here, especially when we consider these local and regional dynamics of proxenia at play. So we'll start off with Epidauros, which is our best documented case by far. And we'll look at this chronologically and then geographically. Now, when we look at these proxenic decrees from a chronological perspective, it's clear that Epidauros in the 4th and 3rd centuries was not just creating proxenic links, but it was renewing them. And it was renewing these links that were closely tied to its theoric activity. So it's noteworthy here that the communities that repeatedly appear in Epidaurian proxenia are also some of its closest neighbors. And this, again, is something that Ioana Crowley picked up on in her recent book. Again, the distances between these communities is not vast. Argos is 41 kilometers away, Corinth 53, Phlius 63, Megara 81, Tegea 85, Aegina is just across the Saronic Gulf. So we are talking about manageable distances here. There are 3 or 4 attestations of proxenia being granted to citizens of Aegina, Argos, Phlius, Tegea, and Heraia from the 4th century into the 3rd century. And again, here the rough distances by land from Epidauros to these neighbors. Corinth, Megara, and Mantinea also figure repeatedly in these lists. So too do Sparta, Megalopolis, and Aegion. And we're going to come back to this list shortly. But for the moment, it is striking how these proxenic ties are clustered in the region of the Argolis itself and among its immediate regional neighbors. And given the recurrence of these proxenic links, it was not just a one-off diplomatic gesture in the same way as we saw with federal proxenies. A federal proxeny was something that just seems to have functioned once, whereas here we see these ties being renewed over a period of time. Now, Argos itself, of course, is less well documented, but there are still some interesting observations to make. Besides the more distant communities that are attested, Rhodes, Thrace, Seleucia, and Kalykadnos, and Mundos in Asia Minor, Ptolemais Barca and Cyrene, on the whole, I think the local and regional connections created by Argos are noteworthy here too. Citizens of Phaneos, Corinth, Mantinea, Megalopolis, Mycenae, and Epidauros are all honored with Proxenia. And again, we see the same clustering of these links in the Peloponnese and among communities that are immediately on the other side of the Corinthian Gulf. And a similar local focus emerges when we shift our perspective to the inverse, i.e. the citizens of Argos who are attested as having been granted Proxenia by another community. Now, Athens and Delphi we would expect in this list, but it's intriguing that the Aetolian koinon, Mantinea, Megara, and Thespiae grant Proxenia to Argives. And again, the number of federal borders that cross by this group of honorans is again striking in the 3rd century context. Epidauros, for its part, gave the status of proxenos to 12 individuals from Argos in total, again, even though the communities are quite close to one another. Several of these other places, Mantinea, Epidauros, perhaps Thespiae, seem to be reciprocal links of proxenia indicating a mutual relationship. So you make a proxenos in the city, and then they in turn make one of your own citizens proxenos. Now, there are further attestations of these reciprocal proxenic links elsewhere in the region and its neighbors. Megara granted proxenia to citizens of Epidauros, Phleus, and Troyzane, and Phleus in return gave proxenia to to residents of Epidauros and Megara, as well as Athens and Delphi. Epidauros also gave proxenia to one citizen of Megara in return, as well as Carthaia, Sabrita, and Thera. So what do we make of all of this away from the data and towards the analysis? Well, the overall pattern seems to be that from the 4th to the 3rd century, communities within the Argolid, especially Epidauros, Argos, and Phleus, established recurrent proxenic ties with one another and with several other communities located in neighboring regions. You can see a rough indication, of course, of some of the range of the proxenic interactions on this map of the Peloponnese. And indeed, most of these communities in the Peloponnese with which Epidauros and Argos created proxenic ties are located within a few days' journey by land or by sea. Now, there are a few observations that we can make here. First and foremost, and perhaps most obvious, is the fact that the geography of the Argolid seems to at least partially account for its prominence throughout Greek history. And we're going to see this manifest itself in its proxenic links as well. The agricultural fertility of the plain, along with its topography, leads to a natural network of communities in the region of the Argolid that are marked by frequent interaction and competition. The region itself of the Argolid, of course, lies along the natural land route connecting the communities of the southern Peloponnese to the Isthmus of Corinth, and then on to the Megarid and Attica. So it's therefore a pretty prominent thoroughfare that would have seen a high volume of trade and travel throughout antiquity, trade that would necessarily have crossed federal borders in the 4th and 3rd centuries. And it comes as a little surprise then that the urban network of the region and its immediate neighbors map so precisely onto the network of its proxenic connections. And so the proxenic web of the Argolid seems to me to be the 4th and 3rd century manifestation of much longer ties among the communities of this corridor connecting the Megarid and the Isthmus of Corinth with the southern and central Peloponnese. And again, this proxenic network seems to easily connect the communities of the Argolid with each other, along with their immediate neighbors, even though they might be in different federal constellations. Now, beyond just their geographical significance, what can we say of the practical character of these connections? Well, the proxenic ties between Epidauros, Argos, and Corinth, I think pretty neatly exemplify longer patterns of exchange among these communities. Now, Corinth has natural harbors on both sides of the isthmus and is therefore a natural relay for trade through the Corinthian and Saronic Gulfs. Since the Archaic period, of course, has been a center of exchange and produced high-quality pottery of its own. So as both a destination of trade and a port of onward transit for agricultural goods produced in the Argolid, Corinth would have been a valuable city with which to cultivate links in the Hellenistic period, indeed as it has been for centuries. So perhaps then this economic exchange lies beneath Argos's grant of Proxenia to Agathonomos, son of Agathos of Corinth in the 3rd century, along with the specific privileges of Attaleia and Ctesias and Acilia, which he received. And these privileges, again, as we discussed at the outset, would have had practical utility to Agathonomos and his descendants, given just how close the geographic and economic links between the communities were. Trade in precious metals also would have flowed through the Isthmus of Corinth to the communities of the Argolid. Peloponnese itself had no deposits of silver, and the availability of other ores was limited, and so metals would have either been imported through the ports of Corinth or from the silver mines of southern Attica by sea or by through the Megarid. The minting of coinage, particularly silver coinage in Argos and Epidaurus, by the communities of the Argolid in this period would, of course, required some degree of imported silver. And indeed, the presence of the coinage seems to indicate a pretty high degree of economic activity. Now, beyond the agricultural productivity of Argos, other communities in their region had their own commodities that would have been involved in this exchange as well. Epidaurus benefited from large tracts of grazing land for ranching and continues to be a major producer of olive oil, while the valley slopes of Phlius's Cora enabled wine production and export, indeed, as they continue to today. Despite a decline in pottery exports in the 3rd century, Argos still remained a prominent producer of ceramics as it became the regional center for mold-made bowls in the Peloponnese, many of which have been found in the Asclepieion at Epidaurus. And interestingly, in Epidaurus, funerary deposits from the Hellenistic period indicate trade links with Corinth, Argos, Attica, and Aegina, again, all communities with which proxenic links had been cultivated. There are likewise indications that Epidaurus had become a producer of the dye used to make purple fabrics by this point as well, so another valuable commodity in local and regional interaction. And we do indeed see this regional interaction play out in kind of interesting ways. There's an anecdote from Aristotle's Rhetoric that tells us of a victor from Olympia who, before his athletic success, had made his living by carrying dried fish from Argos for sale in Tegea. And even as an isolated anecdote, I think this still suggests, as Shipley notes, the traffic and trade on this small scale was routine. So the list of specific vectors and instances and connections of this exchange could go on, but the salient point here is that in the context of mixed economies like these in the Argolid, which relied fundamentally on regular commerce, proxenia on the local scale that we've talked about would have provided a very convenient means of facilitating this inter and intra-regional trade. And again, all of this seems to have worked easily through and across federal borders. So what do we make of all of this? What are some closing thoughts that we can put together? And how does this vibrant picture, I think, of inter and intra-federal proxenia relate to our broader understanding of federal borders in the Greek world? Now, although in my seminar tonight I focused on Lusoi and the Argolid, these two case studies are by no means exceptional in the context of the Hellenistic Peloponnese. And when I was putting this talk together, I was pretty struck by how remarkably similar the proxenic networks of different communities in the Peloponnese are, despite their differences in size, region, or political affiliation. Now, even though it's a fairly humble corpus, the proxenic network of a small Arcadian city like Lusoi that you see here is in many ways not really that dissimilar from the extremely well-documented case of Epidaurus, for instance. There's a cluster in the north of the Peloponnese, a few connections to the south, and then clear links across the Isthmus of Corinth with central Greece and then perhaps beyond. So, of course, the same pattern is at work here with Epidaurus. And then we also see the same pattern of interactions with connections to the south of the Peloponnese and then across the Isthmus of Corinth and maybe some in the north with Argos itself. And we find, again, the same pattern with Arcadian Orchomenos cluster of links in the south, in the north, and then across the isthmus. And the same pattern of links with the city of Claytor in Arcadia that we mentioned at the beginning of this talk. So our case studies are not, therefore, we need to emphasize, exceptional. And they are not necessarily unique. And I really think that I've only begun to scratch the surface of this question of proxeny across federal borders in the Hellenistic Peloponnese and beyond. So there are three thoughts with which I want to leave you this evening. The first, I think, is the most profoundly obvious, but it still needs to be said. It seems to me that it's abundantly clear in the Peloponnese and beyond that individual civic communities were able to cultivate connections with individuals in other communities, both within and across federal borders, through the institution of proxenia. And they seem to have done so very, very frequently, and oftentimes recurrently over long periods of time. There does not seem to me to be any appreciable difference in how proxenia is granted if it's given to a citizen from within the federation or from outside the federation. There seems to me to be no distinction in formulary or privileges. It seems to work the exact same whether the person is a fellow member state of a koinon or someone from beyond the border. So in this respect, then, maybe we can say that federal borders are invisible when it comes to proxenia. But this doesn't mean that the koinon is completely irrelevant in this mechanism. But instead, we need to bear in mind, and this is point number 2, that proxenia across federal borders yet again brings to light the dynamic interaction among an individual citizen, their civic community, and the federation, koinon. Proxenia does not seem to have compromised the integrity of a federal structure or pose a threat to the integrity of a federal structure in the same way as a koinon did not automatically take away the autonomy of its member poleis. Instead, in this interaction, I think we see a very delicate balance among these overlapping zones of agency. And as Aropos has shown, individual cities can use federal proxenia as a means of integrating their own community more closely within the koinon itself. All of this works without compromising the exclusivity that lies at the core of these civic and federal structures. Now, elsewhere, I've tried to compare proxenia in the local realm as something akin to a landed immigrant or a resident alien status. And this relates to something that Mac discusses, where he mentions that even though we see this interaction between federation, polis, and citizen, all of this reinforces these divides and the exclusivity of membership to these groups. By admitting an individual citizen, you are not letting them fully into the citizen community of a given polis. Rather, you're still keeping them at arm's distance. So on the one hand, it is a means of connection, a means of exchange, but not one that automatically compromises or gets rid of the distinction between or among communities. And again, this seems to have functioned the exact same on the level of federal proxenia, local proxenia, within and without federations. And last but not least, we need to remember the longue durée here, because although these interactions that we've talked about this evening are exceptionally well documented by this proxenic web of the 4th and 3rd centuries, in a sense, they are nothing new. And we must bear in mind that proxenia only gives us a momentary reflection of much, much longer ties among regions and communities, and instead only serves to remind us of the longevity of these ties and these exchanges in the local and regional world. And in the process, then, I think that we're called to remember that federal borders were not drawn on a tabula rasa, on a blank slate, but they too existed in dialogue with a much longer and perhaps more entangled history. Thank you very much for coming this evening.
Thank you, Alex, really, for this very rich and brilliant talk. So the floor is open to questions. If you want to ask questions online, you can write in the Q&A session, but you can also raise your hand and we can switch on your mic and you can ask your question live, which is maybe even better. So please. I have a lot of questions, but I'm waiting for other people attending to ask their question. Wow, there is a question by Sebastian. Sebastian, do you want to ask your question live? It would be better, I guess. Può azionare il microfono, grazie. It should work, Sebastian. Our technicians says that it should work, your mic now. E l'ho attivato lui? You have to, Sebastian, you have to switch on your mic on your computer. It seems as if it is, no. È acceso? No. Okay. So in the meantime, I read your question, or maybe you can read his question.
Hi, Alex. I'm Sebastian. Hi, Alex. Thanks a lot for your wonderful talk and for making this possible even at this time of the day and with your entire household ownership. I have a bunch of questions, but limit myself to one on Proxeny on the federal level, referring to what you said about Beosha and Etruria. Would you go so far as to speak of different strategies of using the instrument of Proxeny by different koina?
Thank you very much, Claudio and Sebastian, or rather Sebastian qua Claudio. Sebastian, wonderful to see you, and I hope that all is well. This is a superb question, and it's one that I started getting into this question in federal proxenia, and then I thought that this is probably another seminar in and of itself entirely. Now, it's a bit tricky because we have a few instances of proxenia for this. So the ones that I've come across so far are the Arcadian and the Aetolian and the Boeotian ones. From the corpus that we've taken a look at thus far, I think we can say that there are different strategies used for proxenia, perhaps. But I think a better way to phrase it might be that proxenia is used as an instrument for different political strategies. So rather than proxenia, let's say the Boeotian League having an overall proxenic agenda or proxenic strategy, I think perhaps what we're seeing is rather that proxenia is another tool in the diplomatic arsenal, or another means by which the federation can advance its political or diplomatic agenda. Now, if we speak about the context in which these grants occur, the obvious point that comes to mind is that these tend to occur in the context of federal sanctuaries. So the sanctuary at Thermon, Zeus Lykios, and the Amphiaraon at Aropos. So this is, of course, closely linked to the cultic web and indeed the cultic life of a given federation. Now, that's not to say, I think, that these federal proxenic links are fundamentally cultic. I think that we see federal sanctuaries being used as almost a relay in the network or a central point for these proxenic webs that then radiate outwards. And it does, to me, seem that at the end of the day, these proxenic federal decrees are just recorded at the sanctuaries, but made elsewhere in the federation. Now, how does this relate to the overall strategic picture? I think that Fosse's examination of Aetolia really shows how these proxenic links are clustered in response to the political and strategic realities of these two distinct time periods. I suspect that the same thing could be said of Boeotia as well. However, it would be a bit tricky, I think, to reduce this to a purely strategic perspective. We also see there's an awful lot of diplomacy involved. Ellen has already heard this at a wonderful meeting in Bergamo not long ago, but there is this fascinating interaction between the Ptolemies, the Ptolemaic court, and the Valley of the Muses in Boeotia, in Thespiae, that plays out through a combination of local proxenia, federal interaction, and then athletic competition. So I think it is possible, but at the end of the day, I wouldn't say necessarily these koina have different proxenic strategies. I just think that proxenia is used as a tool in different political and strategic agendas, according to certain koina.
Are there any other questions from the online public? You want
Yes.
to ask something more?
So in the meantime, I also have a bunch of questions, but I will limit myself to ask only some of them. You mentioned the relation, but first and foremost, thank you for this really wonderful paper, which relates very strictly to the subject of our project. So my first question was about this topic. The relation between proxeny and epinomia, the right of pasture. What is the relation between proxeny and the epinomia on the one side, and the existence of koinai horai, which Claudio is studying right now, on the other side? So common zones which were exploited from both neighboring communities. Could we imagine that epinomia becomes even more important, epinomia related to proxeny becomes even more important when koinai horai decrease? I don't know, I'm just wondering, so, but if you can elaborate something on this.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for this, Elena. I mean, this is a superb question, and that actually hadn't crossed my mind, that if someone were to be given epinomia at somewhere like Lusoi, that they would then have access to the koinai horai, to which the city itself had access, which in and of itself is a pretty remarkable web. And then this poses the other question of, if someone is given federal proxemia, are they then given access to the koinai horai? What is striking to me in the Peloponnesian context is it does seem that epinomia is a common right, but not always universal. So it does seem to be something that is specified rather than being taken for granted in certain contexts. Now, this relates quite closely, I think, to enkatesis. And there is a bit of a debate and uncertainty as to whether enkatesis is something that is automatically given as part of the package of proxenia, or whether it is something that has to be specifically given to an individual proxenos. Now, one wonders, in the case of epinomia, just given the patterns of pasturing and land usage, whether epinomia recognizes a relationship that's already there, and whether it is something that normalizes a state of affairs. But it would seem to me that by extension, and again, I'd have to defer to Claudio on this because he knows far more about it than I do, that if one were made a proxenos of a given city and given epinomia, that they would then have access to all of the koinai horai. And then this becomes an even more valuable tool of local exchange. And we also see that proxenia can, a little bit later on in the Hellenistic Peloponnese, be used as something that Athanasios Ritsakas discusses as a means for large-scale landowners to gain access to pastures and lands that are immediately bordering their given citizen community. So I think this is absolutely something that figures prominently in the proxenic geography of it, and probably not something that would have just been taken for granted.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And I have one more question. What happens if two communities connected by proxeny, belonging to different koina, are integrated in the same koinon? Do we have some case studies?
This is a superb question. I can't think of any. Now, this is a bit tricky, because then we get into the question of the relationship between proxenia and isopoliteia, which we see, for instance, in the Aetolian decrees, where we do have people being simultaneously given the title of proxenia and isopoliteia. I can't think of any example off the top of my head here, Elena, but I think that it wouldn't necessarily cancel out the status of proxenos, but presumably if they became part of the same civic community, then all of the rights that would have applied to a proxenos would have come into effect with the individuals as well. But this is something that that I should have a bit of a dig around for and see what I can find. Again, it's a bit tricky because we don't really. There are a couple of different approaches to the distinction between Proxeny and Politeia that I'm not sure have really fully satisfied the question, and I'm not entirely sure about the implications of these things when it comes to an individual civic community, much less two that are immediately bordering each other in different koina. But it's something that we'll have to dig into. I think Mac discusses this at some point, but I don't have it to hand.
Especially, I'm thinking of the case of Epidaurus and Argos. You mentioned this case. They are tied together by a lot of Proxeny decrees, if I correctly remember. But they also were at war against each other. I don't remember how many times. So it can be interesting maybe to explore these in relation to the membership to the Achaean League at different
Absolutely.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, sorry.
It's certainly not the only example that we would have of proxenia between two communities that are either in different federations who are at war with each other, or two communities who are often at war with one another. I mean, Argos and Epidaurus is certainly a very common case, and it is striking to me just how frequently these proxenic links are renewed and cultivated over a long period of time, at certain points at which they certainly did not get along terribly well. Lusoi, for instance, was, if memory serves, attacked by, or at least it was besieged by, I think, the Aetolians, but this doesn't seem to have compromised or impacted its proxenic webs. I can't think of any example of proxenia being taken away or proxenia being canceled as a result of different political circumstances between the two communities. And this does, to me, reinforce, I think, what is the sort of beautiful character of proxenia, in the sense that it creates a relationship between an individual community and one individual, not between two communities. So I think there is some ability here in proxenia for these links between a polis and a proxenos to be maintained, even when the two poleis would have been at odds with each other or at war with one another. In the same vein as honoring an individual from a city that is in a different or opposed federal constellation seems to go underneath the federal border without any problem. I think that this is the sort of thing that probably lies at the core of the institution. In the same way as with Xenia, we see that Xenoi are welcomed even at times of hostility or war. The problem is that many of the dating for these proxenic lists is either relative or a bit nebulous. So it's very difficult in practice to nail them down to precise political events. But I think this just indicates that we're only scratching the surface of what we can really get into through this mechanism, proxenia.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers. Any more questions here in the room or online? No. So maybe it's time for you to start your day.
Time for a nice coffee, and the sun will be up in an hour and a half. Fantastic.
Really, thank you. All of you are invited to our next webinar, which will be delivered by Hans-Joachim Gerke on September the 27th. And the subject will be Alice. I don't remember the title. Here it is. Internal or external borders, the case of Alice and Ledrinoi. So next appointment on September the 27th. Thank you again, really, to Alex McAuley for this wonderful talk, and to all of you for following us. Let's go federal again. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely morning, or evening, rather.